Welcome to Trust Test Hub, where we dive into stories of betrayal, strategy, and consequences. This is a story about 6 years of patience, planning, and a checkmate nobody saw coming. Let's get into it. I'm 34 years old, and I've spent the last 6 years preparing for this moment. Most people wouldn't understand that statement, but let me back up and explain how I got here. Standing in my kitchen with a wooden spoon in my hand, while my entire marriage disintegrated through a speakerphone. In the next room, Mira and I got married. When I was 28, we met through mutual friends. At some birthday party I barely remember now. Dated for 2 years and then did the whole wedding thing. Her family loved me back then because I had a solid job in supply chain management and came from what they called good stock. My parents had money, owned a few rental properties, and I was set to inherit a decent chunk when they eventually passed. Mira's family was different. Her mom, Lyric, worked retail management, and her dad left when she was 12. They saw me as a step up for their daughter, and they weren't subtle about it. The first 3 years were fine. Not amazing, not terrible, just fine. We had a house in a decent neighborhood, 2 cars, the usual middle-class American setup. I worked long hours managing logistics for a manufacturing distributor, and Mira worked in marketing for a mid-sized firm downtown. She always complained about her job, said her boss Maxwell was demanding, and the hours were brutal. I believed her because why wouldn't I? She'd come home at 8 or 9 at night, exhausted, talking about campaigns and deadlines and client meetings that ran late. Looking back now, I can see all the signs I missed. But that's not really fair to past me. When you trust someone completely, you don't go looking for evidence of betrayal. You just live your life and assume the person's sleeping. Next to you isn't plotting how to destroy you, financially and emotionally. The thing that changed everything happened on a Wednesday evening in March about 6 years ago. I had taken the afternoon off because I'd finished a major project early, and my boss told me to go home and relax. So I did. I got home around 3 in the afternoon, which was unusual for me. Mira's car wasn't in the driveway, so I figured she was still at work doing her usual late shift routine. I decided to make dinner as a surprise. Pasta carbonara, her favorite. I was in the kitchen chopping bacon when I heard her car pull into the garage. Then I heard her voice, and I realized she was on her phone. She had it on speaker, and she was talking to someone as she walked through the house. She didn't know I was home because my car was in the garage, and I'd come in through the side door. Her friend Laya was on the other end, and they were laughing about something. I was about to call out and let her know I was there when I heard Laya say something about me deserving a Nobel Prize for staying married to such a loser. They both laughed, and I just froze there with the knife in my hand. Mira said, "When's the divorce sale?" Because Laya wanted dibs on the jewelry I'd bought her over the years. "Next month when his bonus clears," Mira told her. She said she'd planned it all out. Take everything, the house, the cars, the savings accounts. I could keep my pathetic comic book collection, which was apparently the only thing of value I had in her eyes. Then Laya asked if I knew Mira was sleeping with Maxwell, my boss. Maxwell, the guy who signed my performance reviews and determined my annual raises. Mira laughed and said, "Please. He still thinks I work late for career growth." What a mark. Who believes anything? Another voice joined the call. I didn't recognize it at first, but later figured out it was another one of Mira's friends from her gym. This woman told them to show the video from Vegas, and they all started cackling. Mira mentioned some bartender she'd hooked up with while I thought she was at a marketing conference. They were passing around videos, apparently having a grand time mocking the idiot husband who paid for everything while his wife lived her best life behind his back. I stood there in the kitchen, and I didn't move. I didn't confront her. I didn't throw the knife or start screaming or do any of the dramatic things you might expect. I just listened, and I processed, and I started planning. See, the thing about being good at logistics is that you learn how to see the whole picture. You understand how systems work, how pieces fit together, how to move things from point A to point B without anyone noticing until it's too late. My job was literally about anticipating problems and solving them before they became disasters. So that's what I did. I put the knife down quietly and turned off the stove. I grabbed my keys from the counter and left through the side door the same way I'd come in. I sat in my car in the garage, and I waited until I heard her go upstairs. Then I backed out quietly and drove to the grocery store parking lot a few miles away, where I sat and made a list on my phone. The first item on that list was simple: verify everything. I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with before I made any moves. The second item was equally important. Don't let her know that I know. The element of surprise was the only advantage I had, and I wasn't about to waste it by having some big emotional confrontation that would put her on guard. I called my buddy Rodney, who's a divorce attorney. We'd gone to college together and stayed in touch over the years. I told him I needed to talk, but not at his office. We met at a sports bar across town that evening, and I laid out everything I'd overheard. Rodney listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he told me I needed to be smart about this. He said, "Most guys in your position make the mistake of confronting too early, and it gives their wives time to hide assets or build a defense." He told me to act normal for now. Go home, pretend nothing happened, keep living my regular life while we built a case. He said I needed financial records, evidence of the affair, proof that she was planning to take me to the cleaners. All of that would help in divorce proceedings and potentially save me from losing everything. So that's what I did. I went home that night and acted like nothing had changed. Mira was in the bedroom watching TV when I walked in, and she asked where I'd been. I told her I'd gone out for drinks with some coworkers to celebrate finishing my project. She nodded and went back to her show. It was that easy. Over the next few weeks, I started gathering information. I checked our bank accounts and found she'd opened a separate savings account I didn't know about. Small deposits here and there, nothing huge, but enough to show she was squirreling money away. I found credit card statements for a card in her name, only with charges at restaurants and hotels I'd never been to. I took photos of everything with my phone and sent them to Rodney. The affair with Maxwell was harder to prove, but not impossible. I started paying attention to her schedule and cross-referencing it with actual work events. She claimed to have client meetings on certain evenings, but when I casually asked about the clients later, she'd get vague or change the subject. One time I called her office at 7 on a night she said she'd be working late, and the receptionist told me everyone had left hours ago. I also started working differently with Maxwell. I was careful not to tip my hand, but I paid attention to his behavior around me. He'd always been friendly enough, but now I noticed little things. The way he'd smirk sometimes when talking about work-life balance. How he'd ask about Mira more often than seemed normal for a boss asking about an employee's spouse. Once he made a joke about me being married to my job, and several people in the meeting laughed, but I saw something in his eyes that made me want to break his face. But I didn't. I smiled and made some self-deprecating comment and went back to work. Because I had a plan, and losing my temper wasn't part of it. Rodney told me to wait for the right moment. He said I needed to let her make the first move, let her file for divorce, or at least indicate that she was planning to. That way, I could show the court that she'd been planning this all along, that she'd been hiding assets and conducting an affair while pretending everything was fine. It would look better for me in the proceedings, so I waited. Months passed, and I played the role of oblivious husband while gathering more and more evidence. I transferred money to accounts she didn't know about. I started building relationships with our financial institutions and making sure my name was secure on everything that mattered. I documented every late night she claimed to be at work, every business trip that didn't quite add up. Every time she came home smelling like cologne that wasn't mine. And I got angry, really angry. Not the explosive kind that makes you do stupid things, but the cold, calculating kind that makes you dangerous. Every night I'd lie in bed next to her and think about that phone conversation. How they'd laughed about me. How casually she'd discussed taking everything I'd worked for. How she'd been screwing my boss and treating me like I was too stupid to notice. The thing that bothered me most wasn't even the cheating, if I'm being honest. It was the contempt, the absolute disdain in her voice when she talked about me to her friends. Like I was some mark she'd been running a con on and couldn't wait to cash out. I'd loved this woman. I'd trusted her with everything. And she'd been mocking me behind my back for who knows how long. 6 years. That's how long I've been waiting and preparing and getting myself into position. Because about 2 months after I overheard that conversation, something changed. Mira stopped talking about divorce. She actually started being nicer to me. At first I thought maybe she'd gotten cold feet or changed her mind. But Rodney explained what was probably happening. She was waiting for something specific. Probably a financial milestone or a better opportunity to maximize what she could take. That's when I realized I needed to play a longer game. If she wasn't going to file for divorce on her timeline, I needed to make sure when it finally happened, I was in the best position possible. So, I shifted strategies. Instead of gathering evidence for an immediate divorce, I started building a life that would be untouchable when the hammer finally dropped. I got serious about my career in a way I hadn't been before. I worked longer hours and took on bigger projects. I networked aggressively and made myself valuable to people above Maxwell in the company hierarchy. Within 2 years, I got promoted to senior manager with a significant raise. Maxwell congratulated me with this tight smile on his face, and I shook his hand and thanked him, knowing full well what he'd been doing with my wife. I started investing smarter, too. I moved money into retirement accounts she couldn't touch in a divorce. I bought assets in my name only, legitimate purchases that were above board but strategically beneficial. I paid down debt and built up credit. I turned myself into someone who couldn't be financially destroyed by a vindictive ex-wife. And I got in shape. I started working out seriously, not just because it helped with the anger, but because I wanted to look in the mirror and see someone who wasn't a victim. I wanted to be the kind of man who walked away from betrayal looking better than when it started. Petty maybe, but it kept me focused. Meanwhile, Mira settled into this comfortable routine where she had everything she wanted. A husband who paid the bills and didn't ask too many questions, and apparently a relationship with Maxwell that continued behind the scenes. She stopped working late as often, which I figured meant they'd gotten more careful, or maybe the affair had cooled off. Either way, she seemed content to keep the status quo going indefinitely. Her family loved me more than ever because I kept getting promoted and making more money. Her mom, Lyric, would always make comments about how lucky Mira was to have found such a good provider. The irony was not lost on me. They had no idea their daughter was planning to gut me financially the first chance she got. My own parents didn't know anything was wrong. I kept up appearances at family gatherings and holidays. My dad would ask how married life was treating me, and I'd say, "Great, everything's great." My mom worried sometimes that we didn't seem to be planning for kids. But I'd deflect and change the subject. The truth was, I'd been secretly getting annual STD tests after finding out about Maxwell because I didn't know where he'd been or who else Mira had been with. All clear so far, but it was another reason to hate her. 2 days ago, everything changed. Mira's friend Laya started calling my phone repeatedly. I didn't answer at first because why would I? I barely knew the woman beyond seeing her at a few social events over the years. But she kept calling and finally left a voicemail that just said she needed to talk to me urgently about Mira. I deleted it and went about my day. Then she showed up at my house that evening. I was pulling into the driveway after work, and she was standing on my front porch looking panicked. She ran to my car before I could even get out and started banging on the window. I rolled it down and asked what she wanted. She looked terrible, like she hadn't slept in days. Her hair was a mess, and she had dark circles under her eyes. She said we needed to talk about Mira right now and that something was seriously wrong. I got out of the car slowly and crossed my arms, asked what could possibly be so urgent that she needed to ambush me at my own house. That's when she started hyperventilating and telling me that Mira had been screaming for 12 straight hours, and they were terrified and didn't know what to do. I just stood there looking at her and asked why exactly that was my problem. That seemed to confuse her for a second, like she couldn't understand why I wasn't immediately rushing to help. She told me Mira was at her apartment and had been there since yesterday morning. Something had happened and she just started screaming and wouldn't calm down. Laya tried everything. Her other friends came over. They tried talking to her, giving her water, and even called a crisis hotline, but nothing worked. Mira would scream until her voice gave out, and then when it came back, she'd start again. I asked what happened that triggered this. Laya got really uncomfortable and said she didn't know exactly, but it had something to do with work, with Maxwell specifically. She said Mira had gone to his office yesterday, and when she came back, she was different. Just completely different. Started screaming within an hour and hadn't stopped since. Now, here's where it gets interesting. I could have played dumb and pretended I had no idea what was going on. But I'd been waiting 6 years for something to crack, and this felt like the moment. So, I looked Laya dead in the eye and asked if this had anything to do with the affair Mira had been having with my boss. Laya's face went white. She actually took a step back and started stammering about how she didn't know what I was talking about. I told her to cut it out because I'd known for 6 years. Known about Maxwell, known about Vegas, known about the plan to divorce me and take everything. I'd heard her on that phone call 6 years ago laughing about what a loser I was and how I believed anything. She looked like she was going to pass out. She sat down right there on my front steps and put her head in her hands. She said, "Oh God, oh God." She had no idea I knew. She thought I was completely clueless this whole time. I told her everyone thought I was clueless because that's what I wanted them to think. Asked her again what happened with Maxwell that made Mira lose it. Leah looked up at me and I could see she was calculating whether to tell me the truth. Finally, she said that Maxwell had fired Mira yesterday. Not just fired her, but apparently he'd been planning to push her out for months. He'd been documenting performance issues and building a case. And yesterday, he called her into his office and terminated her with cause. But that wasn't even the worst part. According to Leah, Maxwell told Mira during that meeting that their relationship had been a mistake, and he was ending things. He said he'd met someone else, someone younger from the marketing department who actually had career potential. He basically told Mira she'd been a fun distraction, but now she was becoming a liability, and he needed to cut ties completely. I stood there absorbing this information. 6 years I'd been planning my revenge, and Maxwell had just handed me the most beautiful gift-wrapped package I could have imagined. Mira had lost her job, lost her affair partner, and apparently her entire sense of reality in one conversation. Leah kept talking, saying that when Mira came to her apartment, she was still somewhat coherent at first. She told Leah everything that Maxwell had said, how he'd called her mediocre at her job and only kept her around because the sex was convenient. How he'd laughed when she mentioned leaving me. Said she'd be crazy to divorce a guy with my income and stability for someone like him who wasn't looking for anything serious. He apparently told her he'd never had any intention of being with her long term, and was honestly surprised she'd thought otherwise. That's when Mira started screaming. Leah said it wasn't like crying or yelling. It was just this continuous scream, like something had broken inside her brain. She'd pause to breathe and then start again. It had been going on for over 24 hours at this point. I asked Leah why she thought I could help with this. She said because I was Mira's husband, and she needed me, and didn't I care that she was having some kind of breakdown? I told Leah very calmly that Mira stopped being my concern the moment she decided to treat our marriage like a bank account she could raid whenever she felt like it. Leah started crying then, real tears streaming down her face, telling me I didn't understand, that Mira loved me and had just made some mistakes. I laughed at that. Actually laughed out loud. I told her I'd heard the phone conversation 6 years ago where Mira called me a mark and planned to take everything I owned. That wasn't a mistake. That was calculated contempt. She tried to argue that Mira had been confused back then and didn't know what she wanted. I asked if Mira was confused when she was sleeping with Maxwell, if she was confused when she opened secret bank accounts, if she was confused during all those late nights she claimed to be at work while she was actually at hotels with my boss. Leah didn't have answers for any of that. I told her I'd be happy to help Mira with one thing, though. I'd be happy to finally give her that divorce she'd been planning. In fact, I'd already had papers drawn up years ago, just waiting for the right moment. This seemed like as good a time as any. Leah looked horrified. She said Mira couldn't handle that right now. She was clearly having a mental health crisis and needed support, not more trauma. I pointed out that Mira had been perfectly fine traumatizing me for years while planning to destroy my life. Funny how mental health only became a concern when she was the one suffering. That's when my phone started ringing. It was Lyric, Mira's mom. I didn't answer. She called again immediately. I let it ring. She called a third time and left a voicemail saying she'd heard from Leah that something was wrong with Mira, and I needed to call her back right away. Leah was watching me not answer, and she asked if I was really going to ignore Mira's family too. I told her Mira's family had spent years telling her how lucky she was to have me while she was planning to rob me blind. They didn't get to demand anything from me now. I went inside and closed the door. Leah stayed on the porch for a few more minutes, and I could hear her on her phone talking to someone, probably giving updates about how I was refusing to help. Eventually she left. I called Rodney, told him everything Leah had said about Maxwell firing Mira and ending the affair. Rodney was quiet for a minute, and then he started laughing. He said, "This is better than anything we could have planned." Mira losing her job and her stability at the same time meant she was in the weakest possible position. This was the perfect time to file for divorce because she had no leverage left. He asked if I wanted to move forward now or wait. I told him I'd been waiting 6 years and I was done waiting. Drop the papers and let's end this. He said he'd have everything ready to file by the end of the week. That night I got probably 15 calls from Leah and several text messages. She said Mira needed me and I was being cruel by ignoring them. She said I was her husband and had obligations. She said whatever problems we were having could be worked out if I just came and helped bring Mira home. I didn't respond to any of it. I made dinner, watched some TV, and went to bed. Best sleep I'd had in 6 years, honestly. The next morning I woke up to more messages. Lyric had apparently gone to Laya's apartment and seen Mira's condition for herself. Now the messages were more desperate. She said Mira wouldn't stop screaming, and they were worried she'd hurt herself. She said they were considering taking her to the hospital but wanted to try one more time to get her to calm down first. I texted back finally, just one message, saying that Mira was not my responsibility anymore, and they should do whatever they thought was best for her well-being. Lyric called immediately, but I didn't answer. Work was interesting that day. I went in like normal, and Maxwell was in his office like always. I could see him through the glass walls, and he looked stressed. Someone told me in the break room that he'd fired one of the marketing managers yesterday, and apparently it hadn't gone well. They didn't know who, but I obviously did. I had a meeting scheduled with Maxwell that afternoon about a supply chain issue with one of our vendors. I went to his office right on time, and he looked surprised to see me, like maybe he'd expected me to not show up or something. But I sat down in the chair across from his desk, pulled out my notes about the vendor problem, and started talking business. He was distracted the whole meeting, kept checking his phone and losing track of what I was saying. At one point he asked if I'd heard about the firing in marketing. I said, yeah, someone mentioned it in the break room. He asked if I knew which manager it was. I said no idea, and asked if it mattered for our vendor situation. He said no, and we moved on. But I could see him watching me, trying to figure out if I knew anything about Mira, if maybe she'd called me or reached out. I kept my expression neutral and professional, and talked about shipping delays and cost overruns like nothing in my personal life was falling apart. The meeting ended, and I went back to my desk. About an hour later, one of the executives from upstairs came down and asked if I had time for a quick conversation. This was unusual, but not unheard of. We went to a conference room and he closed the door. He said there had been some concerns raised about Maxwell's management style lately. Several employees had come forward with complaints about favoritism and inappropriate relationships. The company was conducting an internal investigation and they wanted to know if I'd noticed anything concerning in my interactions with him. This was it. This was the opening I'd been planning for. I told him that I tried to stay focused on my own work and didn't pay much attention to office politics. But if he was asking about inappropriate relationships, then yes, I'd heard rumors about Maxwell and one of the marketing managers. Nothing concrete, just whispers around the office. The executive asked if I knew which marketing manager. I said I'd heard it was Mira, who just got fired yesterday, but again, just rumors. He made some notes and thanked me for my time. Said the investigation was confidential and I shouldn't discuss it with anyone, including Maxwell. I agreed and went back to work. The rest of the day was normal. I finished up some reports and had a few routine meetings. Maxwell avoided me, which was fine. I went home that evening feeling like pieces were finally moving on the board after years of waiting. More calls from Lyric that night. She'd taken Mira to the emergency room because the screaming wouldn't stop, and they were worried about her hurting her throat. The hospital gave her sedatives, and she finally calmed down enough to sleep. But the doctor said she was showing signs of acute psychological distress and needed psychiatric evaluation. Lyric's message said this was all my fault for abandoning Mira when she needed me most. Said I was supposed to be her husband and protect her, not leave her to fall apart. Asked what kind of man does that to someone he supposedly loves. I texted back, asking what kind of woman plots for years to financially destroy her husband while sleeping with his boss. Said I'd overheard everything 6 years ago and had been waiting for the right moment ever since. Told her the divorce papers would be filed by the end of the week, and she could pass that information along to Mira when she woke up. Lyric didn't respond for a long time. Then she called me, and I actually answered this time. She was crying and saying she didn't know about any of that. She said Mira never told her about Maxwell or about planning to divorce me. I asked if she really expected me to believe that, given all the conversations they must have had over the years. She insisted she didn't know. Said Mira always told her things were fine between us, that we were happy, that she was working hard at her career. Lyric said if she'd known Mira was having an affair, she would have told her to end it immediately because I was a good husband and good men were hard to find. I told her it didn't matter now. What's done is done, and I wasn't interested in reconciliation or working things out. Mira had made her choices, and now she got to live with the consequences. Lyric started begging me to reconsider, to at least wait until Mira was stable before filing for divorce. I said no and hung up. Okay, so for everyone asking why I'm going nuclear on Mira when she's clearly having a breakdown, 6 years. 6 years I listened to her talk about me like I was garbage while planning to take everything I worked for. Some of you are saying I should show compassion, and honestly, that's rich coming from people who weren't standing in their kitchen hearing their wife laugh about how stupid they were. But I appreciate the concern. Trolling really adds to the experience. Friday morning, Rodney called and said the papers were ready. He asked if I wanted to review them one more time before filing, and I told him, no, just file them. He said they'd be served to Mira by the end of the day, and I said, perfect. He warned me that serving divorce papers to someone in a psychiatric hold might complicate things legally. But I told him I didn't care about optics. She'd had 6 years to file on her own timeline, and she'd chosen to drag it out. This was happening now. I went to work and tried to focus on normal tasks, but honestly, my brain was running at about 1,000 miles per hour. Everything I'd been planning for 6 years was finally happening, and it felt surreal, like I'd been training for a marathon. And suddenly someone fired the starting gun, and I wasn't sure my legs remembered how to run. Maxwell called me into his office around 10 row. He looked rough, like he hadn't slept much. He closed the door and sat down across from me instead of behind his desk, which immediately put me on alert. He said he wanted to talk to me man-to-man about something sensitive. I waited. He ran his hand through his hair and said he'd heard I might know about his relationship with Mira. He didn't confirm or deny it. But he wanted me to know that whatever had happened between them was over and had been a mistake from the start. He said he hoped we could maintain a professional working relationship despite any personal complications. I let him finish his little speech, and then I asked him how long it had been going on. He looked surprised that I was asking directly. He said a couple of years, on and off. Nothing serious. I asked if he knew she'd been planning to divorce me to be with him. His face told me everything I needed to know. He had no idea. Mira had apparently been playing both of us in different ways. He said she'd never mentioned divorcing me, that she'd always maintained their relationship was just physical and casual. He said when she started getting more emotionally invested a few months ago, he'd tried to end things and she'd reacted badly, started talking about leaving me and them being together officially, and he'd realized she'd built up something in her head that didn't exist. That's why he'd ended things and fired her, because she wasn't able to keep it professional anymore. I asked if he knew she'd told her friends I was a loser and a mark who believed anything. He said no, and he actually looked uncomfortable. He said, look, he knew what they did was wrong, and he wasn't proud of it, but he never had anything against me personally. I laughed at that. Told him he'd been sleeping with my wife for years, but sure, nothing personal. He said he understood if I wanted to report him to HR or pursue some kind of complaint. He said he'd cooperate fully with any investigation and wouldn't fight it. This was interesting because it meant he was scared. The company investigation I'd heard about must have been moving faster than he expected. I told him I wasn't interested in destroying his career over this. I said I was more interested in making sure Mira understood exactly what she'd lost and what her choices had cost her. He looked confused, so I explained that I'd known about them for 6 years, that I'd heard her on the phone planning to take everything from me, that I'd spent those 6 years preparing for this exact moment. His face went pale. He said, 6 years, and you knew the whole time. I said, yeah, and I documented everything. Every late night she claimed to be at work, every business trip that was actually a hotel hookup, every deposit she made to her secret savings account. I had records of all of it going back to the beginning. Maxwell asked why I hadn't said anything or filed for divorce immediately. I told him because I needed to be in a position where she couldn't destroy me financially when it happened. I needed to build up assets she couldn't touch and make myself valuable enough at work that even if this all came out, I'd still have career options. I said his affair with my wife had actually motivated me to work harder and get promoted faster because I knew I'd need the money for legal fees eventually. He sat back in his chair, looking stunned. He said he had no idea I knew, and Mira certainly never indicated that I suspected anything. I told him that was kind of the point. Hard to rob someone blind if they see you coming. Then I asked him about the new marketing manager he'd mentioned to Mira, the younger one with actual career potential. He looked caught and said that was probably not appropriate to discuss. I said I was just curious if he was planning to run the same game with her that he did with Mira. He got defensive and said no, that relationship was completely different and professional. I stood up and told him I'd be in touch with HR about the investigation if they reached out to me again. He asked if I was going to tell them everything I knew, and I said, "Depends on how cooperative you are going forward." He asked what that meant, and I said I'd think about it. Then I left. Walking back to my desk, I realized I had leverage over Maxwell now. He didn't know what I was going to do or say, and that uncertainty was power. The company was already investigating him, and I had 6 years' worth of evidence about his affair with an employee. I could bury him professionally if I wanted to. The question was whether that served my interests or not. My phone buzzed with a message from Rodney. Papers had been served to Mira at the hospital. The process server said she'd screamed when she saw them but had calmed down enough to sign the receipt. Laya had been there and apparently tried to refuse them on Mira's behalf, but that wasn't how it worked. The divorce was officially filed. About 20 minutes later, my phone started blowing up. Lyric was calling over and over. Text messages were coming in from numbers I didn't recognize. Someone had clearly spread the word that I'd served Mira with divorce papers while she was in psychiatric care, and people had opinions about it. One message was from a cousin of Mira's I'd met maybe twice at family events. She said I was a monster for doing this to someone in crisis, that Mira needed support, not legal action, that I should be ashamed of myself. I didn't respond. Another message from someone claiming to be Laya asked if I was happy now that I'd pushed Mira over the edge. Said that serving her papers in the hospital proved I never loved her and was just looking for an excuse to be cruel. I blocked that number. Lyric's voicemail said I was inhuman, that no decent person treats their spouse this way, regardless of what they'd done. She said Mira couldn't even process what was happening because she was so heavily medicated, and this was legal abuse. I deleted it without responding. My own mother called around lunch. She'd apparently gotten a call from Lyric telling her that I'd filed for divorce and served the papers to Mira in the hospital. My mom wanted to know what was going on and why she was hearing about my marriage falling apart from Mira's family instead of from me. I told her the short version, that I'd found out 6 years ago Mira was having an affair and planning to divorce me to take my money, that I'd waited for the right moment to file first. My mom was quiet for a long time, and then she asked why I hadn't told her when it happened. I said because I needed to handle it my own way without family getting involved and making it messier. She asked if I was sure about what I'd heard 6 years ago, if maybe I'd misunderstood or taken something out of context. I told her I'd heard Mira laughing about what a loser I was with her friends while discussing the timeline for divorcing me. There wasn't any context that made that okay. My mom said she understood I was hurt, but serving papers to someone in a mental health crisis seemed extreme. I asked her if she thought planning to rob your husband blind while sleeping with his boss seemed extreme. She didn't have an answer for that. I told her I had to get back to work and ended the call. The rest of the day was tense. Word had apparently spread around the office about Maxwell and Mira because people kept looking at me weird. Nobody said anything directly, but I could feel the attention. The guy whose wife was sleeping with his boss and just had a breakdown. Office gossip gold. I got called into another meeting with the executive from before. He said they'd made progress on the investigation into Maxwell and wanted to confirm some details with me. He asked if I could verify that Maxwell had been in a relationship with Mira, who was terminated earlier this week. I said, yes, I could verify that. He asked how long I'd been aware of the relationship. I said approximately 6 years. His eyebrows went up at that. He asked why I hadn't reported it to HR when I found out. I said because at the time, I was more focused on protecting myself in the eventual divorce than on company politics. But now that it was relevant to an investigation, I was happy to cooperate. He asked if I had any evidence of the relationship. I said I had 6 years worth of evidence, including photos, credit card statements, text message records, and testimony from witnesses who knew about it. He made notes and said they might need to see some of that. I said I'd have my attorney coordinate with their legal team. The meeting ended and I went home. I ordered takeout and sat in my living room, thinking about how different my life was going to look in a few months. No more Mira, no more pretending everything was fine. No more checking bank accounts for suspicious transfers. Just me and whatever came next. My phone rang around 8. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway. It was a doctor from the hospital where Mira was being held. She said she wanted to discuss Mira's condition and treatment plan with me as her spouse. I said I'd just filed for divorce, so I wasn't sure I was the right person to be discussing this with. The doctor said legally I was still her husband and next of kin until the divorce was finalized. She said Mira was on a 72-hour hold for psychiatric evaluation, but they were considering extending it because she wasn't showing improvement. The screaming had stopped, but she was barely responsive now, just lying in bed staring at the ceiling. I asked if they'd told her about the divorce papers. The doctor said yes, Mira had been informed, and that's when she'd stopped screaming and started shutting down instead. The doctor said she was concerned about Mira's mental state and wanted to know if there was any family history of mental illness I was aware of. I said not that I knew of, but I'd only known Mira for 8 years total, and we clearly hadn't been as close as I thought. The doctor asked if I'd be willing to come in and talk to Mira as part of her treatment. She said sometimes having closure conversations with important people in a patient's life could help them process trauma and move forward. I told her no. She asked if I was sure because it might really help Mira's recovery. I said I was certain and that Mira had plenty of other people who could support her through this. The doctor said she understood but encouraged me to reconsider. I said I wouldn't and ended the call. Saturday morning, Leah showed up at my house again. I saw her car pull up and I considered not answering the door, but I figured we'd have to have this conversation eventually. I opened the door before she could knock and she looked surprised. She started talking immediately, said she'd been at the hospital with Mira all night, and it was bad. Really bad. Mira wasn't eating or talking or responding to anyone. The doctors were talking about transferring her to a longer-term psychiatric facility if she didn't improve soon. Leah said this was serious and I needed to understand how serious it was. I told her I understood, and it didn't change anything. She asked how I could be so cold, how I could watch someone I supposedly loved fall apart and not feel anything. I said I felt plenty, but what I felt was anger that it had taken 6 years for Mira to face any consequences for her actions. Shift to a firm, resolute tone, emphasizing conviction, for everyone who said I should have just walked away and moved on with my life. You're missing the entire point. This was never about just leaving. This was about making sure Mira understood that actions have consequences, and you don't get to treat people like garbage without it coming back around. Walking away would have let her off easy, and I didn't spend 6 years preparing just to let her off easy. Lyric was still on my porch, demanding I do something to help Mira. She said I was being vindictive and cruel, and that whatever Mira had done didn't justify this. I asked her point blank if she thought what Mira did was okay. Planning to rob me, sleeping with my boss, laughing about how stupid I was with her friends. Was any of that okay? Lyric said no, but people make mistakes, and Mira was clearly sorry now and paying for what she'd done. I told her Mira wasn't sorry 6 years ago when she was planning it. She wasn't sorry last month when she was still lying to me every day. She was only sorry now because she got caught and lost everything. That's not remorse. That's just consequences finally catching up. Lyric tried a different approach. She said if I ever had any love for Mira at all, I'd help her now when she was at her lowest. I told her I did love Mira once, back before I found out she thought I was a mark she could manipulate. That love died the second I heard her laughing about me with her friends. What was left was just strategy and patience. She called me heartless. Said I was worse than Mira because at least Mira's betrayal came from weakness and poor judgment. Mine was calculated and cold. I told her she was right about it being calculated. That was exactly the point. Mira had calculated how to hurt me, and I'd calculated how to make sure she couldn't. The difference was my calculations actually worked. Lyric left after that. She said she hoped I could live with myself and that karma would catch up to me eventually. I told her karma already caught up to me, so clearly the system was working fine. Monday at work was when things got really interesting. I got called into a meeting with HR and 2 executives I'd never met before. They said the investigation into Maxwell had concluded, and they'd found multiple policy violations, including the relationship with Mira and evidence of favoritism in performance reviews and project assignments. They asked if I'd noticed any favoritism toward Mira in work situations. I said yes. She'd been given high-profile projects despite mediocre performance and had received raises that seemed disproportionate to her output. They asked if I could provide specific examples, and I pulled out a folder I'd brought with me. 6 years of notes about projects Mira had been assigned, her work quality versus her compensation increases, and how those patterns aligned with her relationship with Maxwell. One of the executives asked why I'd been keeping these records. I said, because I knew eventually this would matter, and I wanted to be prepared. They seemed impressed by the thoroughness. They said based on the evidence, they were terminating Maxwell's employment effective immediately and reviewing all of his management decisions from the past several years, including promotions and raises he'd authorized. They asked if I'd be willing to provide testimony if there were any legal proceedings. I said absolutely. They thanked me and said they appreciated my professionalism in handling such a difficult personal situation. They also said they were promoting me to Maxwell's position as Senior Operations Director, effective next month with a significant salary increase. I walked out of that meeting feeling vindicated in a way I hadn't expected. 6 years ago, I'd started planning my revenge, and part of that plan had been making myself valuable enough that even if everything came out, I'd still have career security. Now I was getting Maxwell's job and a huge raise because I documented everything carefully and professionally. Maxwell was escorted out of the building that afternoon. I watched from my desk as he packed his things with a security guard standing next to him. He looked over at me once and I just nodded. He'd asked me earlier if I was going to bury him professionally, and I guess now he had his answer. Rodney called me that evening with updates on the divorce. He said Mira's attorney had reached out, requesting a delay in proceedings due to her mental health situation. They wanted time for her to recover enough to participate meaningfully in negotiations. Rodney asked if I wanted to agree to a delay. I said no. I'd waited 6 years already, and I wasn't waiting anymore. If Mira couldn't participate, then her attorney could represent her interests. But we were moving forward. Rodney said that was going to look harsh and might affect how a judge viewed me. I told him I had 6 years of evidence showing what Mira had planned to do to me, and any judge who saw that would understand why I wasn't interested in being charitable. He said the evidence we had was strong, the secret bank account, the affair, the phone conversation I'd recorded on my phone 6 years ago when I overheard her talking to Laya and the others, the credit card statements from hotels and restaurants, the timeline showing she'd been planning this for years. He said with all of that, we could probably get a very favorable settlement. I told him I didn't want a settlement. I wanted her to get nothing. She'd planned to take everything from me, so now she got to experience having nothing herself. Rodney said legally she was entitled to some assets from the marriage, but with the evidence of her affair and planning, we could minimize it significantly. I said then minimize it to the absolute legal minimum and not a penny more. The divorce moved forward over the next few weeks. Mira got released from the psychiatric facility after about 10 days. But according to Lyric, she was staying with her mom because she couldn't afford her own place without a job. She'd apparently applied for unemployment, but it was denied because she'd been terminated for cause. Maxwell had documented all her performance issues thoroughly before firing her, so she had no recourse there. Her attorney tried to argue she should get spousal support, given the length of our marriage and the fact that I was now making significantly more money in my new position. Rodney countered with the evidence that she'd been planning to leave me anyway and had been conducting an affair for years. The judge seemed unimpressed with her attorney's arguments. The settlement ended up being brutal for Mira. She got 15% of the marital assets, which amounted to about $30,000 total. Everything else stayed with me, including the house, both cars, and all the retirement accounts I'd carefully structured over the years. She'd have to find her own housing and transportation with no job prospects, since her termination from Maxwell's company would be a red flag for any future employers in the industry. Signed the papers in Rodney's office and felt nothing. No relief, no satisfaction, just a sense that something that should have ended 6 years ago was finally over. Rodney asked if I was okay, and I told him I was fine. Better than fine, actually. I'd spent 6 years preparing for this, and every piece had fallen into place exactly how I'd planned. My parents asked if I wanted to have dinner to talk about everything that had happened. I went over on a Thursday evening, and my mom had made pot roast. They asked how I was handling the divorce, and I told them honestly that I felt good, like a weight had been lifted. My dad asked if I had any regrets about how I'd handled things, and I said, no, none at all. My mom said she understood why I was angry, but she still thought I could have shown more compassion. I asked her if she'd show compassion to someone who planned to rob her blind while mocking her behind her back. She said, "Probably not." And that was the end of that conversation. My dad just said he was proud that I'd protected myself financially and legally, that I'd been smart about it instead of emotional. Mira tried to contact me a few times after the divorce was finalized. Text messages saying she was sorry and wanted to explain things, that she'd made terrible choices, but she'd been confused and scared about her future, that the affair with Maxwell had started because she felt neglected in our marriage and he'd paid attention to her, that she'd never actually planned to take everything from me. She was just venting to friends and exaggerating. I didn't respond to any of it, blocked her number, and moved on. Rodney said she might try to appeal the settlement, but her attorney had advised against it because the evidence against her was overwhelming. She'd signed the papers and that was that. Work got better with Maxwell gone. The new company culture was more professional and merit-based. I hired replacements for the positions he'd left vacant and made sure they understood favoritism wouldn't be tolerated. My team respected me because I'd been there longer than most of them and had proven myself through actual work, not politics. I bought new furniture for the house, got rid of everything that reminded me of Mira, and redecorated the whole place in a style I actually liked. I started dating again after a few months, but nothing serious. Mostly just reminding myself what it felt like to be with someone who wasn't actively plotting against me. Laya tried to reach out about 6 months after everything settled. She sent me a message through LinkedIn, saying she wanted to apologize for her role in everything that happened. She said she'd never actually thought Mira would go through with divorcing me, and she felt terrible about laughing along with the plan. She said she hoped I could forgive her someday. I didn't respond to that either. Forgiveness wasn't something I was interested in offering to anyone who'd been part of that phone call 6 years ago. They'd all thought it was funny to mock me and plan how Mira would take me for everything I had. Now they got to live with knowing their entertainment had consequences. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Mira ended up moving back to her hometown about 3 hours away. She got a job doing administrative work for some small business, making a fraction of what she used to earn. She was living in a studio apartment and driving a 15-year-old sedan she bought with part of her settlement money. Lyric apparently helped her with rent sometimes when she couldn't make it on her salary alone. Part of me wondered if I should feel guilty about how far she'd fallen. But then I'd remember that phone call, her laughing about what a loser I was, planning to take my house and cars and savings, mocking me for believing she loved me, and I'd feel nothing but satisfaction that she'd gotten exactly what she'd planned to give me. Nothing. Maxwell apparently moved to a different city and took a lower-level position at another company. Word was he'd had trouble finding work after being fired for an affair with a subordinate. His professional reputation was damaged enough that he couldn't get hired at his previous level. I didn't follow his situation closely because, honestly, I didn't care what happened to him as long as he was out of my life. The whole experience taught me something important about patience and strategy. 6 years ago, I could have confronted Mira immediately and probably still gotten divorced, but I would have been in a much weaker position financially and emotionally. By waiting and preparing, I'd turned her planned ambush into my decisive victory. Every promotion I earned, every asset I protected, every piece of evidence I gathered, had been part of building toward this outcome. Some people think revenge is about hurting someone back equally, but that's not strategic. Real revenge is about making sure when the dust settles, you're standing tall, and they're not. It's about taking everything they plan to take from you and making sure they end up with less than nothing. It's about patience and precision and being willing to play the long game. I was making pasta when I overheard that phone call 6 years ago. Mira had it on speaker and she was laughing about divorcing me and taking everything. Her friends were cackling about getting dibs on my jewelry and making jokes about the affair. Now 6 years later, Mira's got nothing. Maxwell's career is destroyed and I'm living in my house with a better job, making twice what I used to earn. Turns out the Mark who believed anything was actually the one playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. And checkmate hurts a lot worse when you never saw it coming. Thanks for listening to this story on Trust Test Hub. If you've ever dealt with betrayal or had to play the long game to come out on top, drop a comment below and let me know. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more stories about trust, consequences, and the moves that change everything. Until next time, stay strategic.